One of the reasons that we print our Unitarian Universalist principles and sources on the back of every order of service is that newcomers often say that our principles and sources are one of their first indications that a UU congregation just might be a spiritual home for them. And part of what makes our principles welcoming for a wide diversity of people is that they are intentionally not a creed, not a test of belief. Rather, they are ethical aspirations of how we seek to treat one another amidst our diversity and how we seek to work together to build a more just, equitable, and compassionate world. Our principles and sources are also not written down in stone. Indeed, we explored last week how our sixth source of Earth-centered traditions was added in 1995. Similarly, the original 6 UU principles passed at the 1961 consolidation of the Unitarians and the Universalists, those were revised in 1985 to make them more inclusive. In particular, that meant making them less sexist. For example, the dignity of man was changed to the dignity of every person. And the ideals of brotherhood were changed to the goal of world community. The most substantive change was the addition of a 7th principle, the respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. That we realize that as important as that first principle was, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, that started with the individual, and that we needed to balance that out with a connection to the larger community and world. And it is our 7th principle, which is inspiring a small but growing movement within Unitarian Universalism to potentially revise our principles, which 30 years ago, again, were revised to become less male-centric. Perhaps they need now, especially in light of global climate change, to become less human-centric. The First Principle Project proposes that our support for the inherent worth and dignity of every person be expanded to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every being. I've likewise seen a proposal to expand our 2nd principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, to justice, equity, and compassion in all relations. We are human beings. And I hear this proposal as a challenge to expand our circle of care, compassion, and concern to other beings on this planet who experience some forms of sentience and subjectivity as we do. In last year's Earth Day service, we explored some of the impact of the human population septupling, increasing 7-fold in a mere 2 centuries. From approximately 1 billion human beings on this planet in 1800 to more than 7 billion human beings on this planet today. The resulting environmental impact of our species is jeopardizing the entire planet's climate. We were not always aware of our potential as a species to have a potentially cataclysmic effect on the interdependent web of all existence. As Elizabeth Colbert has written about in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Sixth Extinction, prior to fossil discoveries in the 1700s, we humans didn't know that any species had ever become extinct. But since then, we have come to learn that there have been 5 great mass extinctions during the history of this planet. The first took place some 450 million years ago when living beings were mostly confined to the water. The most devastating took place at the end of the Permian period some 250 million years ago, and it came perilously close to emptying the Earth out altogether. The most recent and most famous mass extinction came at the close of the Cretaceous period. It wiped out, in addition to the dinosaurs, the plesiosaurs, the mesosaurs, the ammonites, and the pterosaurs. Regarding the interdependent web of all existence and its effect on climate change, Colbert writes, "In pushing other species to extinction, humanity is busy sawing off the limb on which it perches, and increasing the likelihood of a potential 6th mass extinction on this planet." Here in the early 21st century, it is important to be honest about what it means to be heirs to the paradigm-shifting discoveries of Copernicus, Darwin, Einstein, Hubble, and so many others. I invite you to consider that minimally that means at least two things. First, it means that we humans are much less singularly significant than it was once reasonable to maintain. Our species has been wrestling for almost 500 years with the growing awareness that we are not the center of the universe, but rather inhabitants of one far-flung planet on the edge of one galaxy that is merely one among more than 100 billion galaxies, not solar systems, but galaxies. Second, it means that other beings on this planet are much more significant to themselves as well as extrinsically significant to us, since our survival depends on the continued flourishing of the diverse, interdependent ecosystems that comprise this planet's biosphere. From this perspective, we can perhaps begin to more fully appreciate the call to consider changing our principles from every person to every being, and human relations to all relations, which by no means means that we've got the human relations part right. It just means that we need to do both and. The goal is to increasingly shift our sense of ourselves from the one best species who can do whatever, could and should do whatever it wants without consequence, to a more realistic sense of ourselves as one among many beings on this planet who are inextricably woven together in an interdependent web. The person who has most helped me in thinking through how we might make such a shift with the maximum amount of integrity and compassion is the philosopher Peter Singer. He's a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. Singer is almost certainly the best known and most widely read of all contemporary philosophers, which might be to damn him with faint praise, right? What we consider best-selling for philosophy is different than Stephen King, for example. But his 1975 book, Animal Liberation, has been translated into 13 languages and has sold more than 500,000 copies. That being said, Singer himself admits that when I wrote Animal Liberation, I really thought the book would change the world, and soon. I know it sounds a little grand now, but at the time, the 60s still existed for us. It looked as if real changes were possible, and I let myself believe that this would be one of them. All you have to do, though, is walk around the corner to McDonald's to see how successful I have been, and to know that McDonald's is around almost every corner. There are some parallels to our own UU movement, which also was founded in those hope-filled 1960s. However, Singer's lament about factory farming in the fast food industry is from 1999, and I just saw this past week that McDonald's is beginning a decade-long plan to use only cage-free eggs. You know, so ethics, pro-ethics, egg McMuffins or something, I don't know. And also that's in the wake of another recent announcement that it is moving away from chicken treated with antibiotics. And while McDonald's is a long way from getting the Michael Pollan Food Justice Seal of approval, when such food giants make a shift in the right direction, there are real ripple effects that go across the whole industry. For those not familiar with Michael Pollan, and he's written many books, but his short phrase thing of, how do you think about food justice? He says you should eat real food, what your great-grandparents and great-grandparents would recognize as food, right? Eat real food, not much, mostly plants. So it's not that you can't ever eat meat and ever eat junk food, but in general, eat real food, not much, mostly plants. And to give you an overview of how Singer thinks we might become less human-centric and more inclusive and just toward all beings who can experience suffering, the following are 4 of his central convictions. 1, pain is bad. Pain is bad, and similar amounts of pain are equally bad, no matter whose pain it might be. By pain here, he includes the suffering and distress of all kinds. This does not mean that pain is the only thing that is bad, or that inflicting pain is always wrong. Sometimes it may be necessary to inflict pain and suffering on ourselves and others, surgery for example, because it will lead to less suffering in the long term. So pain is bad, and it's equally bad no matter who experiences it. And two, humans are not the only beings capable of feeling pain and suffering. Of course, the nature of the beings will affect how much pain they suffer in any given situation. Very quickly here, I think the major word to keep in mind is spectrum. That a lot of people want to go here. If you change it from all people to all beings, and they immediately go to these extreme slippery slope places. And I regularly say, and I think this is helpful to keep in mind with any Big Tent movement like Unitarian Universalism, that we are pluralists and not relativists. So just saying that there's a spectrum, saying that many things may be the case, is not to say that everything goes or anything is okay. 3, when we consider how serious it is to take a life, we should look not at the race or sex or species to which that being belongs, but at the characteristics of the individual being killed. For example, its own desire about continuing to live, or the kind of life it is capable of living. So I don't have time to go into this now, but there's some pretty remarkable studies that have been done with great apes as far as the amount of human words they can use and what they can communicate, etc. We're responsible, and this is the 4th one, we're responsible not only for what we do, but also for what we could have prevented. This is what Catholics used to call sins of omission and sins of commission, right? We're responsible not only for what we do, but what we should have done and failed to do. Singer writes, "We may never kill a stranger, but we know that our intervention will save the lives of many strangers in a distant country, and yet do nothing." You can think of the current refugee crisis as an example. Consider, for example, the fact that the sum that buys us a meal in a fine restaurant would be enough to provide basic health care to several children who might otherwise die of easily preventable diseases. If you're interested in going deeper into the specifics of these issues, I'll be leading a 6-week class here at UCF titled, "What Does It Mean to Live Ethically?" It'll be on Tuesday evening, starting this Tuesday at 7 p.m., and it's based on the 3rd edition of Peter Singer's book, Practical Ethics, which has been the classic introduction to applied ethics for almost 30 years. If you have time and interest, you are welcome to read the relevant sections of the book prior to each class session. In that case, the reading assignment, you can go to frederickuu.org/Peter Singer to see the outline for the class. But you're welcome to attend the class regardless of whether you have time to read the book. At the beginning of each session, I'll outline the basic framework of the arguments for that day's focus. Over the 6 sessions, we'll be exploring topics such as, is it ethical to buy luxuries, beyond basic needs when others do not even have enough to eat? Should we buy meat from intensively reared animals? Am I doing something wrong if my carbon footprint is above the global average? Equity and discrimination on the grounds of race or sex, are they justifiable? Abortion, the use of embryos for research, and euthanasia, and whether political violence and terrorism are ever justifiable, such as like eco-terrorists, for example. Then in mid-November, we will have a sequel to this morning's service in which we reflect further on wrestling with Peter Singer's ethics in light of this 6-week class, and I'll also be inviting brief reflections from participants in that Tuesday night class, inviting them to share about if there's any ways in which they see the world differently or feel led to live differently as a result of the class. You're welcome to come to as many or few of the sessions as your schedule allows. In the meantime, allow me to put just a few more items on the table. Some critics say that Singer, as well as other supporters of any form of legalized euthanasia, risk going down the slippery slope to Nazi science, an accusation that fails to account for Singer in particular being well aware of his own family's history as the child of Jewish parents who fled their native Austria in the late 1930s. There's also the perennial question of, to Singer, how much do you follow your own ethics, right? Can you follow the implications of your logic? He did not, for example, kill his mother, who had advanced Alzheimer's disease and whose care was consuming money that these critics said could more profitably be spent elsewhere. But Singer has never said he is perfect. Rather, his challenge both to himself and others is to continually live into a more ethical way of life. And he has for many years, for instance, given away more than 20% of his income to organizations that have a track record of doing the most good for the world's poor, an approach he calls effective altruism. He's got a great TED Talk. If you Google Peter Singer, TED Talk, Effective Altruism. My title for the sermon borrows from an anthology of Singer's essays called Unsanctifying Human Life. What I take him to mean is that it is no longer reasonable to maintain the ancient religious worldview that all human life is sacred and inviolable from womb to tomb. Instead, for more than 150 years, our species has been wrestling with Darwin's discovery that we humans are not a little lower than the angels and uniquely special. Instead, we are a little higher than the apes and deeply interconnected with the other life forms and larger ecosystems of this planet. There's a lot more to say, and we'll be exploring some of the further implications again of these perspectives on Tuesday nights for the next 6 weeks, as well as again in an upcoming sermon. There's also the longer-term question of whether this congregation is interested in becoming a sponsor of the First Principle Project. That is, advocating to change the wording of our first principle from every person to every being, or second principle from human relations to all relations. Any such change in the UU bylaws requires at least 15 congregational sponsors as a first step, and the latest update I heard is that it currently has 8 sponsors, but they just presented their first workshop at General Assembly in June in Portland, so they're just getting started. To clarify, we would be voting, if we chose to vote to sponsor this at our annual meeting, for example. We're not voting to make that bylaws change. We're voting, because you can't just do that. You vote on whether to start a 2-year congregation at the UU-wide level of whether this is this a worthy discussion that Unitarian Universalists should be having about whether 2 years after that to actually make a change. For now, I'll conclude with the closing part of a Buddhist Metta meditation. Metta, M-E-T-T-A, means loving kindness, that seeks to open our heart and expand our compassion, starting with compassion for ourselves, which is crucially important, then extending that compassion to other human beings, and finally extending loving kindness to all beings with the capability of experiencing suffering. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be well. May all beings be peaceful and at ease. May all beings awaken to their true nature. May all beings be free. In the spirit of respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, with an increased existential awareness of our place as one among many species on this far-flung but beautiful and precious planet we call Earth, I invite you to rise and embody your spirit as we sing together hymn 1064, Blue Boat Home.